Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this fall's WARE seminar. I'm Susan Traverso, the Provost and Senior Vice President at the college, and it's really my pleasure to welcome all of you to this program as well as our panelists. Cybersecurity could not be a more pressing or relevant topic for all of us in our lives, as increasingly our country and countries around the world become interconnected through technology, through exchange of goods. Our very day-to-day life, I think we recognize we navigate increasingly fully dependent on technology, and so keeping those technological networks secure is really a pressing issue. When John Craig first announced or suggested this topic, I was immediately interested. I think the topic's become all that more complex as we as a nation have weighed out how we are collecting our own information to maintain security. So an already complex and pressing issue is made even more pressing as we think about our own information in the sense of security. Let me tell you a little bit about the WARE seminars. The WARE seminars are programs run by the Center of Global Understanding and Peacemaking twice, sometimes 3 times a year. And they aim to bring experts to campus to engage all of us in pressing international matters that we must engage with in order to think of ourselves as informed global citizens. They are part of the larger WARE colloquium, also administered by the Center, very generously endowed by Judy and Paul Ware, who I'm very happy to welcome here and thank again for your continued support for this program. In addition to the seminars, the WARE colloquium also includes our premier lecture each April, our lecture on peacemaking, and the college has year after year attracted Nobel laureates to speak with us. We are in the final negotiations for next April's WARE lecture, and again, I think we're going to be able to bring in yet another Nobel laureate to engage with the campus. Very, very important lecture, engaging us all with really luminaries in helping us think about the world as a peaceful place and not just a place of conflict. In addition to the seminar and the lecture, the WARE colloquium also has helped us engage around issues of peer mediation, conflict resolution, and peace and global understanding. And we have been able to move that part of the colloquium together through the good leadership of John Rudy, who's also here, our peacemaker in residence, who is teaching a course this fall on conflict resolution. So together, the WARE colloquium is a very important program at the college, and again, we are so thankful to Judy and Paul for their support. Some other important thank yous to make before we turn the program over to the panelists. I can't say enough about the leadership of John Craig, our ambassador in residence. He is a real mover and shaker on campus in helping us engage with experts of the caliber of the experts we have this evening. But he also is engaged himself in international travel, and so unfortunately, I understand he's somewhere between Oman and Abu Dhabi this evening and could not be here for the program, but I know he very much is looking forward to a full report because this was really his brainchild. So John Craig, our ambassador in residence, available to students who might be interested in international careers for advice and guidance, and he is connected with the Center for Global Understanding and Peacemaking. I also must thank this evening Kay Wolf, our program manager in the center, who navigates all of the logistics for all of these programs. Thank you, Kay, for all you do. Barry Fritz for managing the audiovisual this evening. And then finally, I'd like to recognize Professor David Kenley here in the front row. David Kenley is an associate professor of history at the college, but he is also the recently appointed director of the Center for Global Understanding and Peacemaking. David is an expert in Asian history and Asian studies, particularly about the Chinese diaspora. And he's bringing great leadership to the college's center. Thank you, David. Now, about the Center. The Center for Global Understanding and Peacemaking is an interdisciplinary center that gathers faculty get together, particularly from our 3 interdisciplinary minors, one in international studies, one in Asian studies, and one in peace and conflict studies. But the center also engages faculty and students on a range of topics, and they oversee the WARE Colloquium. The center is housed in Nykerry Hall, and if you're interested in learning more about the programs, Kay Wolf is always there, ready to meet with faculty and students, and of course David Kinley as well. So this evening's program, for the next hour, hour and a half, we'll be engaging around this important topic. The panelists will each share their perspective, their expertise, and then they will be engaging with our moderator around questions which I understand were sent in ahead of time from a number of you. I've been told that there were 95 questions. We won't be going through all 95 questions this evening, but I think the 95 questions, I think, have given the panelists a good sense of the strong interest around this topic and the kind of issues that you as students and faculty would like to engage them around. The moderator tonight is our own Joe Wunderlich, our Associate Professor of Engineering here at Elizabethtown College. I love this part of his biography. Joe has taught 31 different courses, and I can hardly often keep up with the range of expertise that Joe brings to the Department of Engineering, particularly around computer engineering. He is the founder of the Robotics and Machine Intelligence Lab here at the college, and he played a central part in moving our computer engineering program through ABET accreditation. He has developed courses on sustainable design and engineering related to architectural design, as well as his core expertise in computer engineering. He brought to the college a rich experience, both as an academic at Purdue University, but also in industry, working at the IBM supercomputer lab, as well as a number of other think tanks and high-tech offices in Texas and California. Joe is really a unique member of our faculty, and I can think of no better person to moderate this evening's program. Joe.
Thank you very much, Susan, for that introduction. Time is of the essence here, so we want to go very quickly. To start off, we have three very distinguished scholars on cybersecurity. Scott Borg is the Executive Director of the U.S. Cybersecurity Unit, the first person here. John Smith, Senior Counsel for Raytheon, and Ian Wallace at the Brookings Institute as a fellow. I'll give a little lengthier introduction right before each of their talks. I just want to say there was 101 questions. I know that's a little bit much, but we wanted to have inclusive a voice of all the campus because we don't have time for questions at the end. So we've parsed it down and vetted all the questions, and hopefully we have some very concise questions that will be enlightening. Our first speaker is Scott Borg, and he is unquestionably one of the world's leading authorities on cybersecurity policy and methods, and perhaps, and most of us believe, the world's leading authority on economic impacts of cyber attacks. So he's our first speaker. There'll be 3 15-minute talks followed by the panel of questions.
Cyber changes everything. The cyber security revolution, the advent of cyber attacks are transforming security more than the advent of nuclear weapons. I'm somewhat floored by how to tackle this subject, let alone the 101 questions that we've been submitted. So I'll begin by just making a few kind of orienting remarks here. When we entered the nuclear age, we entered it with Hiroshima. And so everybody saw what a nuclear weapon could do, and people felt motivated to actually learn something about them before they started talking about them. We've entered the cyber attack era, cyber defense era without a Hiroshima. So there's relatively little understanding of just what these weapons can do and what the ramifications are. I'm going to begin by trying to answer 3 of the questions that we were handed because they seemed a good introduction to what's going on here. One of the questions was essentially, how much damage could you do to an economy with a cyber attack? How bad could they be? It's possible to create a cyber attack weapon like the one that was used to attack the Iranian nuclear program, that will migrate from device to device, that will run diagnostics on its target, that will carry out an intricate manipulation of the controls to damage the target. It's possible to run a pure cyber attack that will destroy an electric generator, and that attack works better the larger the generator. The Idaho lab did a demonstration of that, which was later leaked to CNN. If you want to see the video, you can find it online. So it's possible to launch an attack tool that will migrate from device to device, find its way into our electric generators, and utterly physically destroy them. The attack causes the rotor to hit the stator. It causes the rotating part to hit the coils around it and shred and incinerate, and it destroys it to such a degree that it bends the shaft, and any turbine that's connected to it is physically destroyed. It takes 2 years to make an electric generator, a large one. The world capacity is very limited, and they almost all come out of China. If you destroyed a large number of them, it would take many months to replace them. If we commandeered facilities, we did everything we could to replace them, it would take many months. The kind of cyber attack weapon that I'm just describing could potentially destroy nearly all the generators in North America. It could leave us without power for 6 or 8 months or more. You could simultaneously run a cyber attack that would blow our pipelines, explode our refineries, set them on fire, completely create havoc in our banking system, so basically the whole economic system was no longer functioning. You could cause trains are controlled almost entirely by computers. You could cause trains to crash, and not only crash, you could cause them to crash in tunnels, on bridges. You could pretty much destroy all economic activity. You could shut it all down. Electricity alone will, if you destroy electric power alone, that will take out, all by itself, about 70% of electric power. It takes 8 to 10 days for everything to, shut down over 70% of the entire economy as measured by GDP. I plead jet lag. If you take out oil and gas, it takes a little bit longer, but the amount of the economy that shuts down is almost the same. So we're talking about attacks that would shut down all economic activity pretty much as we know it. The remaining economic activity that's not part of that 70-odd% are things like the value you receive by occupying your home even though you're cold or hot and in the dark and so on. So if you do that kind of attack, if you had that kind of cyber campaign, you shut down to the economy to that degree, we're not talking about being unable to get insulin if you're a diabetic. We're not talking about problems with emergency services or medical treatment. We're talking about no food. We're talking about no safe water. We're talking about all of the necessities of life being pretty much gone. The death toll would be enormous. When we try to model this, and we imagine an attack like this on the United States, we get at minimum tens of millions of fatalities, probably a lot more. So a cyber attack, a cyber campaign, at worst, would be exceeded in destructiveness only by a nuclear war. So this is a really big deal. To reassure you a little bit, I'm not actually too worried about this happening anytime soon. Not because no one knows how to do this. Actually, the United States, China, and Russia could all do this right now. And if they wanted to, so could Germany, Britain, and Israel. But none of those countries want to cause anything like this to happen. China, Russia, the United States, we'd all sacrifice lives, put our lives on the line in order to protect each other's critical infrastructures. Last thing any of these three countries need would be the world economy in ruins, demagogic leaders on the rise on a war rampage and so on. But it's important to realize what is possible. Once you realize what's possible, suddenly I hope you'll be very impatient with journalists who start talking about cyber warfare as though it's ongoing. A cyber war would be like a real war. It would kill people. It would destroy lots of stuff. And I hope you'll become impatient with cyber terrorism and talk about that. We've never seen an act of cyber terrorism yet. Cyber terrorism would also put people in peril. It would spread terror. It would put people in physical peril. So we've got enormous danger. We've got a lot of just loose talk in the news, confusing everybody about what's possible. And we urgently need the population as a whole to understand this better, because the politicians don't. 85% of America's online every day. People come home from work. I mean, you're all online every day, I'm sure. People come home from work, from teaching school or driving trucks or working in factories or whatever they do, and they turn on their computer and they check their email and they go to their social networking website. They surf for pornography. They surf for recipes. They stream YouTube and Netflix. Politicians finish their day's work and they go and fundraise. Politicians are people. They're not at home in a dimly lit room with a mouse in their hand. They're at home grinning and shaking hands. Most of them don't do their own email. I can say this from personal experience because I try to brief these people. And they're very smart, but they've got a long way to go. So we need people like those in this room to propel this whole thing forward. How am I doing on time? Am I almost up? A couple more minutes?
5, 6 more minutes.
Oh, great. Okay. So I'll tell you, I told you about the worst kind of attack. I'll tell you about what's happening right now, the worst attack that's actually ongoing. There has been a lot of talk in the news about Chinese cyber attacks, Chinese industrial espionage. This is one thing where the hype actually understates the reality. China has been stealing masses of competitively important business information, and they've been doing this on a scale that's quite remarkable. In fact, China is stealing this information at a rate that's 10 to 20 times the level of all the rest of the world put together. 95% of the attacks that we're able to identify and analyze are coming out of China. Why? Developed economies grow at 2 to 4% a year. That's the range. Useful numbers to know, by the way, to understand what you're reading about economics in newspapers. If growth rate of a developed economy drops much below 2%, we're in pain, as we've been lately. If it goes much above 4%, it's an overheated economy. It's not going to be able to sustain that. So that's the range for developed economies. Copycat economies, developing economies, can have a growth rate of 8 to 13% a year, which is what China's been able to produce. China did a kind of a deal with its people after Tiananmen Square. It basically told them that they needed to put up with an oppressive regime, and in return they would get extraordinary economic growth. This is sort of the working contract that's allowing China to function right now. I'm oversimplifying. I'm with a Chinese historian chairing this institute and such. I need to acknowledge I'm oversimplifying, although we could do a whole day on that. I sometimes talk for an hour and a half just about Chinese economics. So anyway, China needs to maintain this growth rate. The only way they can maintain this growth rate is by copying Western technology and Western business models. And this is in general how a copycat economy, a rapidly developing economy, sustains that kind of growth rate. When you're developing mid-level, when you're copying mid-level manufacturing, it's relatively easy. You can tour factories and take pictures of everything and just go home and set it up that way. You can get the people selling you the equipment to tell you how to set it up. And this is what China has done for a number of years. But as you move on, as you exhaust the mid-level manufacturing, you have to move into higher tech things. And as you move into higher tech production, all the stuff you need to know is not visible anymore. It's inside the computers. It's inside the computers that control all the valves, switches, pressures, temperatures in those facilities. It's inside the computers that control the robotic functions and so on. The only way to get that information then, the only way to copy those production facilities is to either get somebody to hand you all that information or else to steal it. China's had remarkable success in getting people to hand them that information, but they're under such pressure to maintain this growth rate that that's not enough. So stealing competitively important business information is now part of the economic development model of China. It's a big part of their whole growth strategy. The immediate effect of this is actually to increase value creation in the world. It's to help China lift more people out of poverty, which has been the greatest economic miracle probably in world history, is China's ability to do that. It's been terrific. So they feel very justified in doing this, and to some extent they are justified. However, the world economy is propelled by new technology. That's what economic development is built on in the modern world economy. It's technological innovation, implementing new technologies. And one of the effects of these massive information thefts is we're taking resources away from companies and people that know how to innovate and handing it to people that essentially don't. We're handing it to people whose chief innovation skill is being able to strip off features so they can make things cheaper. But it's those extra features, it's the cool new features that companies like Apple are coming up with. That's what's driving the economy forward. Those are the features that are going to create economic growth all across the world a few years down the line. So we're putting world economic growth at risk. We're actually hurting it by letting this activity go on. So that's the biggest thing right now that's already going on in the world, that's a reality that we have to cope with. And that's one of the things that China and America need to be talking about in all kinds of negotiations at all levels. Now I'm sure I've talked my 15 minutes, but we can come back to some of this.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Scott. John Smith is our second speaker. He's senior counsel at the Raytheon Corporation. It's a company, one of the biggest companies in the United States, 68,000 employees, over $25 billion in annual revenue. John is Raytheon's first cybersecurity lawyer and the first chief privacy lawyer. Previously, he served a similar role in President George Bush's White House. He clerked for Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito when Judge Alito was on the U.S. Court of Appeals. Graduated magna cum laude from Princeton and Brigham Young University Law School, and is fluent in Russian and Ukrainian.
Good evening. Glad to be here at Elizabethtown College. You've made me feel welcome. I want to thank the organizers. I want to thank Ambassador John Craig for the invitation to come here. He and I ran into each other at the President Bush's presidential library dedication in Dallas in April. Dallas is where my family and I live. And he told me he was organizing this exciting cyber event, and so I'm delighted to be here. Glad to be at a school that's religiously affiliated. As Joe mentioned, I studied law at Brigham Young University. Noticed that the motto there is similar to yours. At BYU, the sign as you enter campus says, enter to learn and go forth to serve. And we also have blue and white as our school colors. Particularly glad to be among students. Raytheon has as a central focus of its outreach, working with students particularly in science, technology, engineering, and math. Delighted to hear about the growth of the engineering department here at Elizabethtown College. It's a promising field. Cybersecurity is for young people in law, in engineering, in policy fields, sociology. Lots of different expertise will be needed to deal with the revolutionary change that's come from cyberspace that Scott mentioned in his very first sentence. Before turning to my remarks, I'll give a disclaimer. I'm here in my personal capacity, not in my Raytheon capacity, and any views I express are my own and may not necessarily reflect those of my company. So I've been asked to focus on some legal aspects of cyberspace. so I'm going to talk about a couple of legal challenges in securing cyberspace. So the goals of the bad guys have not really changed, right? The old goals have been to steal, spy, disable, manipulate, or destroy things of value. In the Soviet Union, for example, while we think of it as losing the Cold War, certainly one thing that the Soviet Union was extremely effective at doing is stealing secrets, industrial espionage from companies and innovators in the West. Now, in the new domain of cyberspace, the bad guys have some of the same old goals, but they have vast new powers that have been given to them by the nature of cyberspace. So how can we get a sense of what this new vulnerability is like? So I'm from the Star Wars generation, and I'll use an analogy from the first Star Wars movie, which I guess is really the fourth Star Wars movie now. And you remember at the end how the Death Star is destroyed by the good guys, the rebels. And I remember as a young kid thinking to myself, how could the sophisticated empire allow a simple, fatal vulnerability into the Death Star such as it could be destroyed? Somehow I was willing to suspend my disbelief about everything else in the movie. That one thing troubled me. Of course, it was because the Death Star was designed to defend against a very different threat. And little Luke Skywalker and R2-D2 presented an asymmetric threat, right? And using the Force, we're able to do something that those who were designing the Death Star and building it thought could never quite happen. Now that we are faced with the very serious questions that Scott outlined in cyberspace, I get it. I get how something like the internet could be designed, and as people realize its usefulness, it starts to take on all sorts of functions that were never originally intended. And now individual human beings, companies, governments put all sorts of valuable information, in many cases their most valuable information, onto computers that are connected to other computers that are connected to bad guys. So it's difficult for law-abiding governments or the private sector to counteract cyber threats through traditional legal means. And that is in large part due to the nature of cyberspace. One thing you know from your interactions in cyberspace is that you can hide or mask your identity. A key legal question is attribution. Who did it, right? Much harder to determine in cyberspace. Second feature of cyberspace that poses legal challenges: the remote access that one can have across geographical and political borders from one country or one part of the world to almost any other part of the world. That complicates legal questions like which legal system is responsible for dealing with bad actors and bad actions? Or more directly, which legal system has personal jurisdiction over a particular human bad actor? Now, can I reach the bad guys? A couple of countries have been mentioned already, and a couple of them don't have extradition treaties to the United States. So even if we know who the bad guys are, we can get through the attribution problem. We often, at least U.S. law enforcement, can't reach them. And a third aspect of cyberspace is the universal connectivity that cyberspace affords, which is great, except when it's not, right? It exposes all of us to personalized direct harm, both as individuals and as organizations. So another question that the law asks is, how can a victim that is harmed seek legal redress? Well, what if those harming you are a foreign criminal gang or a foreign government? Assuming for a moment you could even tell who was getting at you. What could you do in the U.S. legal system to get redress? Symantec, a computer security company, came out with a report last year of depicting the scale of cybercrime victims, and by their estimates, there are 1.5 million victims of cybercrime every day. 2/3 of online adults have been victims at some point already, and 46% of those within the last year. So cyberspace lacks governance. The bad guys like it that way. And what do I mean by governance? 3 main questions. The authority of law. Who's authorized to make rules for cyberspace? Secondly, the power of law. Who has the power to enforce those rules? And third, the substance of law. What are the rules that apply in cyberspace in a particular situation? That substance right now is very uncertain. How do laws, many of whom were adopted before the internet was even invented, apply to cyberspace? And there is very little judicial case law on point in the area of cyberspace. So not only is the law uncertain in this area, the law is traditionally slow in evolving. That's one of the strengths, or has been one of the strengths, of our common law system here in the United States. But the pace of technological change is accelerating at a pace that we have never seen before in this country. And the evolution of law has become disconnected from that pace. There have been no changes in over a decade in the relevant private sector federal statutes that at least tangentially govern this area. There have been a couple of statutes like FISA reform and the Patriot Act that you've probably heard about, but they deal primarily with government powers. Almost nothing in the private sector. So let's move from the overview of how cyberspace by its nature challenges our traditional legal system and look at a specific legal constraint. And that is that law-abiding U.S. cyber defenders of cyberspace, either here at this university, at this college, or in a company that you might work for someday, or in government here in this country, U.S. defenders must stay home. What do I mean by that? Common understanding of U.S. law defining what you can do when bad guys are attacking you is very limited. Basically, you can do anything you want on your own network, either your own personal network, or if you're a company, on your own company's network, or an institution on your institution's network. But you can do virtually nothing on anyone else's network without appropriate authorization. There's an extremely broad U.S. criminal statute, which the U.S. Department of Justice continues to interpret broadly. It's called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And I know some of you are in the engineering department, and will understand, and others of you are familiar enough with computers that you can probably get a sense of its breadth from this one short excerpt. This is from the U.S. Code, the criminal section, Title 18. Whoever intentionally accesses a computer without authorization or exceeds authorized access and thereby obtains information from any protected computer, which is defined as virtually any computer in the United States, shall be punished by imprisonment or fine. It's extremely broad. So what could be done to resolve this legal constraint? One could change the law, so defensive reconnaissance and response by institutions within the law can be clearly allowed. Think about a real-world analogy here. If someone were to come into your house and grab your most valuable couple of possessions and race out the front door again, what could you do? I just told you that in U.S. law, pertaining to computer networks, you can do anything you want on your own network in your own home, but virtually nothing else anywhere else on anyone else's network without authorization. Could you follow your own property once it was stolen? Could you repossess or destroy your own stolen property? Could you damage the bad guy's property or equipment? And would you be responsible for any collateral damage done to innocent people as you pursued the property that had been stolen? Right now, the answers to those questions in the real physical world and in the cyber world are very different. And in the cyber world, they're very constraining to the good guys or the victims. If individuals or institutions were permitted to do at least some things on other people's networks without authorization, they could gain visibility into what's being taken from them and by whom, and get some early warning that such threats are coming, and would have some room to maneuver. Cyber resiliency is a byword now is a watchword in the industry. Very hard to prevent a determined cyber attacker from getting in. So what institutions and individuals hope to have is cyber resiliency, a way to adapt, get the bad guy out as soon as possible, or minimize what the bad guy can take out. Give a couple of analogies. We have any history majors here tonight? Okay, few. Raise them high. Be proud. There we go. All right, excellent. So, those of you who like history from the Middle Ages, right? What were fortifications like in those days? You had a long, flat glacis, right, all around the fortification, so you could see the bad guys coming from a long way off, right? If you had enough time, you graded the land so you could keep your guns trained at the same angle all the way on their approach to you, and hopefully as you fought them off and they retreated from your walls, you could keep firing them without changing the angle of your guns. In the Battle of Britain during World War II, how did England survive, right? Ian can probably tell you more about that than I. But two key aspects of that were intelligence and radar, developed in large part by Raytheon, and a very friendly buffer of land between that the attacking German planes had to cross over before they hit their intended targets, the cities and manufacturing centers of central England. And due to that long friendly buffer area and that radar and intelligence that it provided, Great Britain was able, through attrition of pilots and planes, to finally wear down the enemy such that their attacks became too expensive. Think about that in the cyber context. There are some thinkers, and you can read their views online, who think that under current law, companies and institutions ought to be able to do something back, right? Hack back is one phrase you hear. But do something more aggressive, an active defense or an active response than is traditionally understood under current law to be permissible. They rely on defensive property doctrines, hearkening back to days in old England where remote farmers needed to do something to protect their property against thieves when the sheriff was very far away and law enforcement could not come to your rescue. But these theories, I think, are probably too risky for too many companies to embrace. It's probably not a practical solution. So, how am I doing on time? 3 minutes. All right. So what is part of the solution? Well, one part of it, and there's no silver bullet in cybersecurity. This is going to be a issue for the rest of my professional life, and maybe yours too. But perhaps one of the best roles for responsible private actors like my company and my industry and Elizabethtown College and other law-abiding U.S. institutions is to engage in information sharing. Probably heard about this quite a bit in the news. The idea is to share information openly and quickly about threat indicators, bad cyber things coming your way. Some sectors of our economy already share pretty well, finance, power, and the defense industry. How many of you have, when you've received a suspicious email from a friend, done something to alert your friend that, hey, something looks like it might be amiss with your email account? How many? Yeah? Great. Good. Well done. How many have you picked up the telephone and called a friend to say, hey, did this email really come from you? It's got an attachment I didn't expect or has a link. How many have done that? Good. All right. So the good thing about certain kinds of information sharing is that all that really needs to be shared is a bad internet protocol address or the techniques that the bad guy has used. What's not relevant is the human content in the message, right? To do this certain types of sharing. Of course, that's what gets people worried about, from a privacy perspective. And it's also not relevant who particularly is sending these this malware or these cyber threats, or why they're doing it. Or even the fact that there has been a data breach at a particular institution. One fact I love, has anyone here received a notice from a company that you're a customer of, for example, saying that they have suffered some sort of cybersecurity privacy data breach, something along those lines? Have you gotten a letter or an email? Yeah, okay. Well, I saw a statistic recently that if you lived in the neighboring state of Maryland and you were an average resident, last year you would have received 244 such notices. What could you do with them, right? There's often very little that an individual recipient can do once they receive such a notice. Information sharing of cyber threats focuses on the information that really matters and puts it in the hands of the institutions who can do something about it. And the goal is to alert that an alert population makes hacking of that institution too costly. Cyber theft is driven by economics. Scott mentioned that. So why not try to drive it out of business? At least drive it out of business from hacking your institution. The less penetration there is, the more that forces the bad guys to customize their targeting, and that takes resources and time. So in many ways, perhaps the best option available is to engage in extensive information sharing with like-minded, good actors. I've got some analogies to share to try to bring that out, but perhaps we'll save that for the question and answer period. Thanks very much.
Our third speaker is Ian Wallace, a fellow at the Brookings Institution for Cybersecurity in the Security and Intelligence Foreign Policy Center. The Brookings Institution is a foreign policy organization in Washington, D.C., conducting research that strengthens American democracy, fosters economic and social welfare, security and opportunity, and secures a more open, safe, prosperous, and cooperative international system. Ian Wallace has extensive cybersecurity policy research experience, including military issues and private versus public roles. Previously, he was a senior official for the British Ministry of Defense for 17 years, helped develop the United Kingdom's cyber strategy and cyber relationship with the United States, and most recently, he's in the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. as a defense policy counselor and nuclear counselor. Also, he was a Harvard Fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, including researching military implications and new cyber capabilities. Please welcome Ian Wallace.
Thank you. I am also extremely pleased to be here, and I'm humbled to be in such company with Scott and John. I'm British, and my background is with the British Ministry of Defence. So the only way to deal with sitting with real experts is to focus on what you really know. So I'm going to concentrate my comments on the military aspects of this issue and the international aspects. Not all of them, but I'll pick out some of the key issues. And I'm going to try and do that through a discussion of this term cyber war, which, for the reasons that Scott explained, is a terrible term. It's vastly overused and vastly misunderstood. And I'd like to sort of just go into a little bit more depth about why I think that's a dangerous thing, not least because it's a good foil for fleshing out some of the other issues and challenges that pertain to the cyber issue. One way to think about what cyber war is to understand what cyber war isn't. Cyber war isn't crime. We know what crime is. Crime can come from overseas in a cyber context in a way that it probably doesn't usually, but when you have your bank money taken out of your bank account, that is crime, that is not war. Cyber war is not, or espionage is not cyber war. Now, you can have state-sponsored espionage, and you can have economic espionage, and you can have state-sponsored economic espionage. And those things are all very damaging, particularly if it is a state who is trying to steal national security secrets, which has certainly been a problem in recent years. But that's not war in itself. And sabotage, even sabotage is not necessarily cyber war. So Stuxnet, you could argue, and international lawyers have argued over this, doesn't necessarily constitute an act of war. Now, ultimately, what war is what the president or the head of state decides it is. And if any one of those things, crime or espionage, sabotage, rose to a level where the United States felt it had to respond militarily, then you would be in a war. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're war. And there's international law that governs that, but there's a certain amount of flex within that. If you want to design it more positively, you get a little bit more theoretical. And one of the best thinkers on war in the last 2 centuries, the Prussian general Clausewitz, who made an argument that for war to be war, it needed to be violent and instrumental, i.e. have a political intent. And actually, if you take that view, then you pretty quickly come to the view that cyber war itself, i.e. war in cyberspace only, is pretty unlikely. You cannot be violent simply within cyberspace. You can be violent through cyberspace, but if you cause enough violence, then the chances are that any state that's being attacked will respond by non-cyber means, and then it doesn't become a cyber war, it just becomes a general war. And there are alternative views who take a more sort of Chinese philosophical view that says you can have economic war and one thing another, but I think actually Clausewitz is a pretty good place to start. And the consequence of that is we need to be very careful about thinking about cyber war in its own terms. But it's more than that. There are really good practical reasons why it's an unhelpful phrase, and that's what I really want to get into today, leaving the philosophy behind. And you might say, why is that? We use the metaphor of war very regularly. We talk about war on drugs, we talk on war on obesity. It's a pretty good way of rallying troops, if you want to use another metaphor, to a cause. And for people who feel that they're under attack all the time, you can understand why war is a useful metaphor. But I want to give you 5 reasons why I think in this particular instance it's particularly unhelpful. First of all, wars are generally fought by professionals in uniform. And certainly, since we had an all-volunteer force, the instinct has been to get out of the way. Let other people fight the war, make it their business, and you can support them and feel good for them, but it's someone else's job to do that. In this particular context, that's incredibly unhelpful because everybody has a role to play. The Australian version of the NSA, now called the ASD, Australian Signals Department, did a piece of work a few years ago where they studied all of the things that you could conceivably do to protect your computers and came to the conclusion that 85% of all attacks could be prevented by just 4 things: whitelisting, patching, systems control. In other words, everybody can have a role. Now, really sophisticated attacks are going to require professionals. Sort of advanced persistent threat are going to require people who really know what they're talking about, but they don't have to be either in the military, and everybody in this room potentially has a role in seeing what's going on so that they can call in those professionals when they're required. Secondly, wars end, or at least we have an expectation that wars will end. Cybersecurity isn't going to go away. The world is getting increasingly connected. Computers are being used to control machines, the so-called Internet of Things, which we've heard a lot about. And as a result of that, we're becoming potentially more and more vulnerable to attacks through those networks. And yet, it feels like those attacks aren't coming. So if you build up the expectation that there's going to be a cyber 9/11 or a cyber Pearl Harbor, and it doesn't happen, you get cynical, your guard dips, and actually things that really could be causing you harm, sort of things that Scott was talking about, you tend to ignore because the really big threat hasn't manifested itself. Thirdly, wars legitimize expedience. And we can talk about this for some time. I think this was probably, at least in my mind, more of a concern a couple of years ago, even a year or so ago, when Congress was looking at passing legislation. And there was a movement within some parts of the Congress that the answer was just to give the problem to the DoD, and that the military would defend the nation. Not something that I think was actually that practical, even if and it certainly wasn't particularly sensible in my mind to militarize on an ongoing basis, something which, as I said, is going to be here for a long time. I think actually in the light of the Snowden revelations, we're in an interesting position where we see the war on terrorism has legitimized a set of actions which actually undermine cybersecurity. So I haven't entirely worked through the logic train there. But I think it is still the case that if we think of cyber war as a war, there is a real danger that we throw the wrong type of capabilities at the problem, and in doing so, miss important opportunities to make us safer. Fourthly, talk of, it gets in the way of actually doing what I just said, making us safer. If we talk about cyber war as this thing that happens between states in cyberspace, we miss out on 2 other areas where I think we could more realistically expect to suffer harm. The first of those is at attacks that happen at a level below war. And that could be crime, but we feel we roughly know how to deal with crime, although, as John pointed out, there are some significant challenges in this area that don't exist in other areas, not the least of which is the guy who's picking your pocket is probably in a country that doesn't necessarily respect your version of the law. And that is really difficult. If we're focusing on cyber war, we're probably not focusing on how you can create the conditions by way that guy who is attacking you can be properly brought to justice. You're not using your international leverage in the right way. But espionage is the most obvious example. There is actually, people tend not to appreciate this, there's no international law against espionage. It's fair game, as people would say. What is usually used to prosecute spies is domestic law. And of course, if you're spying through the internet, or you are not necessarily in a place where you can be grabbed by the FBI or whoever's in charge of law enforcement, and therefore it's much easier to spy on another country. You also can do it on an industrial scale because of the nature of the internet. And getting your head around that is a completely different issue if you take away this idea of cyber war. But secondly, it detracts from the way in which we actually fight wars, which is something I've been thinking about a fair amount for the last few years. An important part of how we might have to fight wars in the future, and what makes this very different, is that we're going to have to fight on the home front just as much as we're going to have to. We're not just going to send people off to war. We're going to have to deal with that, and therefore, this concern about protecting critical infrastructure is really important, because we don't want to get ourselves into a position where we self-deter, that we don't go out into the world to enforce international law and look after our own interests because we're afraid of what might happen to us at home. So that's a good reason why we need to look after our critical infrastructure. And that's, to a certain extent, being taken care of. What we're probably not so good at is the question of protecting ourselves, having the military protect themselves when they go on expeditionary operations. A lot of effort gets put into this by the DoD, but take for example that almost all of the operations that the US has fought since the Second World War, including the Second World War, has been fought as a coalition. And many of those countries who the US fights with are much less good at protecting their own cybersecurity as the US. As soon as the US starts communicating with them, it puts itself at risk. Now, there are ways of protecting that, but thinking through some of these issues often gets obscured by this phantom of cyber war when Keith Alexander, director of the NSA, at least up until about 6 months ago, when he went up on the Hill, got asked about people stealing the Chinese stealing intellectual property, rather than how the military are going to be able to make sure they can make use of the hundreds of billions of dollars in investment that they have. Fifth and final area to consider is how the United States talks about this subject frames how the rest of the world. The US is the world's cyber hyperpower, to use a sort of French term. And as a result of that, what the US does almost sets the tone for what everyone else does. And that, if we're not careful, can rebound on the United States and other like-minded countries like my own, the UK. It's a bit disingenuous to talk in some ways about militarizing cyberspace, given that ARPANET was itself a DoD-funded project. But it is a real concern that if the US is not careful about how it presents the way it operates in cyberspace, and is seen to be overweening in its use of offensive capabilities, which I would argue, at least in a military context, it ought to be developing and thinking about how it uses, then it creates the conditions by which other, particularly authoritarian countries, are legitimized in what they're doing to build up barriers to the internet or enforce controls on their own population, and even allows them to encourage less authoritarian countries like India and Brazil, a country whose president has cancelled her state visit specifically because of admittedly sort of spying allegations, but related allegations, and allows them to use devices like the UN's International Telecoms Union to impose controls on the internet, which actually undermine not only the US's ability to look after its own cybersecurity by working with other countries to reduce their risk, but also undermines the potential economic benefit of the internet. Now, that's not to say that the United Nations is a bad thing by any means, and a group of government experts, another organization, has been meeting in the course of this year, and the Chinese have finally agreed that the UN Charter should apply to cyberspace, which means that the laws of war are relevant in cyberspace. So that there is definitely opportunity to engage and get into diplomatic conversation about what works. But all I'm saying is that if we frame everything bad that happens to us in a war-like metaphor, then that is the way in which people will see us, and they will build barriers to defend themselves accordingly, because everything that they know they have, whether it's true or not, and it probably is in many cases, they believe that the United States and our allies have bigger and better tools to harm them. And of course, if everybody built barriers and no one engaged through the internet, this sort of amazing thing that we've created, that would be a very bad thing. And not only would we be open to major attack, but we're also missing major opportunities to benefit from this extraordinary thing we created. Thank you.
Okay, this brings us to the panel part of our presentation of our event tonight. Again, we had 101 questions from various classes, students, faculty, and staff, and those were vetted by the speakers. And then there's a selected number of questions here. Hopefully we can get through 5 to 7 questions for each speaker, and they'll be concise, but if they choose to elaborate, we maybe have a couple less questions. The first question is for Scott Borg. I was lucky enough to have him guest lecture in my class for an hour and a half yesterday, and he stated 5 key steps of cyber attack, and then we spent the rest of the day together until midnight. He gave me a good education on cybersecurity. Could you please, Scott, elaborate on these 5 steps and perhaps emphasize which one or 2 are the most critical?
Okay. I was hoping you'd ask me to give me a chance to say something about resilience. After John Smith brought it up, because it's crucial to all of this. Let me talk about that first. Let me talk about resilience.
Okay, that's first.
And I'll come back to that.
Yes. Okay.
Resilience is like the magic word for this era. In the nuclear defense era, the key word was deterrence, and by deterrence, people meant retribution. Mm-hmm. In the era we're in now, that doesn't work. One reason it doesn't work is anybody who's carrying out a cyber attack, if they want to go to the trouble, can be anonymous. You can go buy a laptop for cash or steal one. You can write your malicious code, your attack programs, in a way that doesn't tell who you are. You can travel to a city where you don't live, sit down in a hotel lobby, be online anonymously, and launch your malicious codes. One laptop can carry enough malicious instructions, enough malware to destroy the Western world. I mean, the honest to God. So if somebody wants to be anonymous, they're anonymous. So we can't rely on retribution because we don't know who to attack. And Ian Wallace was also talking about we don't have a clear line of what constitutes war, and we've got all kinds of possibilities for attacks that aren't going to justify retribution. So we've got to start thinking about something else. And the key thing in the cyber world is to build systems that are just not very vulnerable. There's a systematic way of thinking about this. If you want to be resilient, you want to limit the effects of the attack. That means for critical infrastructures being able to modularize everything really quickly. So you break everything up into units that are ideally self-sufficient. You want power generated in a distributed way, and you want to be able to modularize the grid. You want to be able to do the same for oil and gas, for all of your critical infrastructures. The second thing you want to do to make things resilient is you want to have good substitutes. When we calculate the effect of a cyber attack, when I do the economics of this, the main thing I always want to know is what substituted after the attack. What do we do after the attack? And if you improve the substitutes, you reduce the impact of the attack. So to think about substitutes, think about it like an understudy in the theater. The understudy is who steps in for the star when the star can't go on that night. The understudy is not wasted, not sitting idle. The understudy is a supporting player. We need operations, we need systems that are supporting player operations, that are creating value, that aren't wasted, but can step into critical functions in the event of a cyber attack. We need ways to limit the knock-on effects, the dependencies.
the ways that one cyber attack will trigger a whole set of cascading events through our economy. And that's partly dealt with by the modularization that I was already referring to. And we need ways to shorten the duration. And John Smith touched on that when he talked about information sharing, because that's not just a way to ward off attacks, it's a way to shorten the time it takes before we are responding and up and running again. Those 4 categories need to be part of all our thinking as we move ahead into this era. Resilience is really what this future world has got to be all about.
Thank you. The next question is for John Smith. You had a couple analogies you wanted to put in your talk, so here's the chance.
Good. So, talking about information sharing. One of the other ways that the legal system, the traditional legal system is challenged by cyberspace is that information sharing doesn't align very well with the way that our legal system is set up. What do I mean by that? I've heard one analogy that appeals to me about what good cybersecurity is like, and that is a public health analogy, right? Where you've got bad germs that are contagious, right? We even use the word virus, right, to describe one type of computer malware, right? And the health of one individual is affected by the health of the general population, right? In the public health world, same in the cyber world. And how do we measure success? Well, in both worlds, we measure success by early detection and fast alerts to the potentially affected population. So it's not a competitive or zero-sum game. And the thing that we're going to have to get comfortable with to be good at information sharing is that different entities and players will make different contributions. The contributions will be unequal. But the benefits will be largely shared of good information sharing systems that talk about cyber threats. And our legal system is usually set up to match rewards to contributions, and we might not be able to figure that out all in a precise way in cyberspace. And finally, in public health, as in cybersecurity, the focus is on getting well and moving on, and not, as is often the legal system is focused on, getting retribution after you've succeeded in attribution, right? If you talk to chief information security officers and they're being hit by an attack, what they usually care about is just make it stop, right? More than any other interest of who it's coming from or why or how long it's been here, just make it stop. But I think these things, this kind of system has precedent and it has promise. One situation I can think of is weather data, right? I bet everyone here checks the weather regularly. Where does that weather data come from, right? You probably access it immediately from a private vendor, a website or something, but where do they get their data from, right? And in many cases, it's from a government, some governments, weather satellites or other resources. So there's an example where you've got unequal contributions made to the data, but it's valuable when it's distributed. Even if it's distributed by those who didn't initially obtain it. We've got 3 kids, my wife and I, and they like to go to the zoo. So I'll use another analogy, right, of animals in the African savanna, right? So making an unequally good contribution to perceiving incoming threats are giraffes, right? And the zebras and the wildebeests, they hang around the giraffes. Why? Because if the lions are coming, the giraffes will see them first, right? It's an example of unequal contributions, but shared benefits. They all run away, right? Follow the giraffe's lead. So we're going to need to innovate and develop creative models, right, for doing information sharing, and it's going to be a challenge to do that because it doesn't align with our traditional legal system or other traditional systems that we're used to in terms of partnering on the front lines in our living rooms, in our corporate offices, and in our educational institutions to have a safe, protected cyberspace that we can use for productive ends.
Our next question is for Ian Wallace. How do political philosophies, cultural histories, and various religious views influence governments and peoples to either help or look the other way when terrorism threatens? And what percentage of the world would you estimate views the U.S. efforts to maintain world peace as a positive thing?
So I've been looking at this, and I've come to the conclusion this must be somebody's sort of thesis question that they're looking for help with. And I'm guessing they're probably a political scientist, not a medieval historian like me. So I don't know is the honest answer, but let me give you some more helpful thoughts. I think the vast majority of the people in the world and governments in the world abhor terrorism, both, but it sort of as a human reaction and also as a tool of statecraft. But what I think is also the case and relates back to the issue at hand, cybersecurity, is that countries, for the most part, have their interests and act on their interests. And what we see playing out in cyberspace is a sort of different, nuanced manifestation of how those interests come to play. So Scott gave us a pretty good example of how the Chinese requirement, frankly, to build their economy has trumped anything that anyone in America and Europe can do to convince them that what they are engaged in terms of state-sponsored espionage needs to stop because it risks undermining international relations. And I think where we've got to now, the President of the United States has got to the point where Congress and business have convinced him that he needs to go to the Chinese president and say, you need to dial back because this is going to interfere with a much bigger relationship that actually is in all of our interests. And at least towards the beginning of this year, he was getting some traction with that. I think Russia is another good example. It's a number of friends and colleagues at Brookings who spend their entire life looking at Russia, and I think they scratch their heads sometimes when they try and work out what President Putin sees as Russian interests. But at least one of those seems to be keeping the US on its back feet a good deal of the time. And one of the ways in which the Russians appear able to do that is to, at the very least, tolerate a proportion of criminals who have the capability to do quite sophisticated cybercrime against other countries, and, as seems to be the case, when it's useful, bring those capabilities to bear on behalf of the Russian state. So what makes cyber interesting and different, however, is generally speaking, those capabilities can operate just under the radar at which it's worth countries like, for example, the United States responding. So the attacks on the financial institutions, which have been attributed to Iran, are annoying. They mean you can't always get online and get your money, move your money when you want to. But it's not necessarily at a level where the US government feels it needs to attack Iran. Not least because there's a risk that that may escalate it into something bigger and grander. And I think one of the questions going forward is whether we can keep that level of stability and stop some of those cyber incidents bubbling into something more dangerous, and then more positively, how we prevent that happening in the future so that we're not victims of this annoyance level of attacks from other countries acting on their interests.
Thank you, Ian. Next question is for Scott Borg. You mentioned when you were lecturing about the penetrability of systems and how you test them, and that you had not seen yet a system that cannot be penetrated by somebody. Could you please elaborate on that?
Anytime you have a first-rate team trying to attack a system, if you give them enough latitude, they will find a way to do it. When the Army has groups of people going around checking military systems, military networks to see whether they can get in, they always get in. If the people who work for me want to get into your machine, they can. What this means is we can't stop attackers, absolutely. And when we're testing systems, we don't really care whether somebody can break into that system or not. Somebody will always be able to. What this means is our strategy for cyber defense is all about cost. We can make it really difficult to get in. We can make it necessary to employ really top-flight experts for a long period of time to get in. We can, at every juncture, make it really expensive for an attacker. If we can make it more costly for the attacker, if we can make it cost more benefits than they gain from the attack, we've won. And if we can make it more costly to attack us than attack somebody else, we've sort of won. We're ahead. So the strategy for cyber defense is not absolute, and it's not some unreachable ideal of not being, keeping everybody out, keeping everybody from doing attacks. It's just about getting the costs up, and you can do that. You can use encryption, if you want, that's publicly available, that's open source, that's free, that an intelligence agencies like China's, or in fact our own NSA, can't crack, or could only crack with such an incredible expenditure of computing power and such that it's not going to be worth their while to do so. You can do all kinds of other things to secure your machine, including the ones that you're constantly hearing about in the advice, of how to secure your machine. You can do those things, and when you do that, you're going to be too expensive to attack for most of the adversaries to bother with. So this is a soluble kind of thing. It's a doable kind of thing. And the key to it is to understand there's no absolute solution. Oh, and by the way, scanning all our stuff, turning it over to the military or the NSA to scan all the traffic going into critical infrastructures or whatever is useless because they can't identify the malware. They can't filter it out that way. You have to deal with it in a much more local sort of way because you can't recognize it easily. If it's customized, if it's mutating, if it's self-concealing, you can't scan for it.
Our next question is for John Smith. How does your previous work as primary legal advisor to the White House Homeland Security Council compare to your present work at Raytheon? And what were the first issues you faced at Raytheon's first cybersecurity, or as Raytheon's first cybersecurity lawyer?
Yeah. Well, as some of you probably have relatives or friends who have worked in government and have worked in companies that work around government. I guess the biggest difference would be that at the White House, the team that I was supporting as a legal advisor, they were doing the mission, right? Our team was doing the mission, whereas at a company like Raytheon, now our team is supporting the mission. The similarities would be that I had a similar cybersecurity and privacy role in the White House and now at Raytheon, and I think it's a sign of the times, right, that now companies need people with this kind of expertise, a whole lawyer, right, to focus on cyber and privacy questions. And at the White House, they called me the cyber lawyer, and I'm not aware that someone had needed to have that title before, right, or that nickname. It has become such a significant aspect of not just what governments or militaries have to deal with, but ordinary companies as well. What's different between the White House and working in the private sector in this same space is the authorities, the legal authorities that my clients have, right? So in the White House, I carried with me, or had very close at hand, a Constitution of the United States, because my main client, his responsibilities and limitations are set out in Article 2 of the Constitution and some of the amendments, right, and elsewhere. In Raytheon, they don't call me very often for constitutional interpretation questions. Because, among other things, the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to the private sector. But in both cases, because private-public partnership is so important, especially in cybersecurity, it has been interesting to be on both sides of that partnership, right? Having been on the government side before and now in the private sector side in the area of cybersecurity.
Thank you, John. Next question is for Ian Wallace. With the rise of potential cyber threats, would it be appropriate to take a step backwards, perhaps, and not use advanced technology to monitor basic resources such as our power grid and water supply?
On a case-by-case basis, yes, it may be. Realistically, I don't think that's going to happen in any serious way. All of the evidence of the last several centuries of technological advances that people have tended to do what is convenient, potentially at the expense of the security concerns. Washington is currently going through a process following an executive order by the president in February to develop a cybersecurity framework across the critical infrastructure, essentially to baseline the standards for cybersecurity. And at least one of the things that people are looking at is the extent to which, for example, in the water sector, having the ability to manually turn on and off the switches that control the water may be a mitigation that helps against cyber attack. And actually, this is something that the military are very concerned about as well. The battlefield is increasingly dependent on information systems, both in terms of communicating, but also operating. So just down to very basic things like GPS. Many soldiers several decades ago would have learned how to navigate their way around the battlefield with a compass. Now a young soldier has a handheld device that tells not only where he is, but where his friends are. If someone can tamper with that, potentially they can do a lot of damage to the operation. And so one of the things the US military and other militaries around the world are doing is wondering and training their troops some of the traditional skills so that they are resilient in the face of that kind of attack. I think ultimately, though, that is the approach. It's building in the ability to mitigate that kind of attack rather than a whole-scale Luddite rejection of technology, which ultimately is not going to be successful.
Yep. Thank you, Ian. Next question is for Scott Borg. Considering this is a different audience than yesterday where you spoke to the engineers and computer scientists, could you please give us a little bit of details on the increased vulnerability of industrial control systems and perhaps some details on Stuxnet?
Everywhere where we're producing anything, we're running it entirely by computers. That's how the modern economy works. If you visit a production facility in some part of the world where labor is really cheap and it's a modern, high-tech product that they're turning out, there aren't any more people in that factory or facility than there would be in ours. We use computers now to do everything, not to save labor or even to cut costs, but because we can carry out processes that we can't do any other way. We can make hundreds of coordinated adjustments simultaneously to turn out batches of things in large volume that we could previously barely do at a test tube scale. Yeah. So computers are not something we can give up, we can go, do without for security reasons. They are the foundation for how we produce everything. All of those computers have to be run by rather elaborate programs. We have what are called process control programs operating very locally. We have what are called SCADA programs that are coordinating many processes, often in different locations. So this is how we do all of that. The technical details of how we manage this can make the difference between whether these systems are incredibly vulnerable or really, really difficult to tamper with. And they include, one of the things that I talked about in Joe's class is the programming language that's chosen can make the difference between whether the system is just really easy to hack and disrupt or not. We have a lot of students now coming out of computer engineering departments that are being taught computer engineering as though it were computer science. In other words, as though it were not something practical, not something that had to meet engineering demands, but something that's like science for science sake, arts for art's sake. When we ask engineers to build a bridge, we expect that bridge to be capable of carrying some traffic. We expect that bridge to be able to withstand winds. We expect that bridge to be able to function in a real-world environment with all of the strains and stresses that entails. We're turning out graduates from computer engineering departments that are unable to write a program that will be resilient, that will be robust in a normal operating environment. We're turning out graduates who have no idea that certain programming languages are creating vulnerabilities for attackers and others are not. There's a great need to make our computer so-called science departments into computer engineering departments and make them relevant to the world we live in. And because of the leftover desire of these departments to have academic respectability, this is a real problem.
Our next question is for John Smith. Is there a way to increase security while maintaining the public's privacy? And what role has anonymity played in cybersecurity in your experiences?
Yeah, it's a good question. The short answer is yes. There is ways to increase security while maintaining privacy. In my industry, you'll often hear a saying that you can have security without privacy, but if you have no security, you will have no privacy. There are, however, as the questioner probably rightly perceives, often trade-offs that need to be made between privacy and security. And coming up with the right balance is a very interesting and dynamic conversation that's going on in our country right now. In cybersecurity, for example, if you're looking at an organization or a company, there are a number of things you can do to increase your cybersecurity, but one thing you almost have to be doing is monitoring your network, monitoring your email traffic, seeing what's going across the wires of your network. Internet activity, email. If you're not seeing your traffic, it's extremely difficult to detect, much less stop or mitigate cyber threats. You all, I'm sure, are familiar from daily life with other trade-offs in privacy and security. To get here, I had to go through airport screening. I'm sure you know the experience very well, right? But think of what the alternative if we decide that we need to check to see if anybody going into an airport is carrying a dangerous item. We have a couple ways to do that, right? We can use magnetometers, we can use imaging devices, or we can pat every single person down, right? Which would be the greater invasion of your privacy? We have watch lists at borders, right? So there's another example of a trade-off between security and privacy. We've got individuals whose names and histories and dossiers are tracked, so that when someone crosses a border, when anyone crosses a border into the United States or out, we can check. Vehicle searches on military bases. That's been something under discussion in the last 48 hours, right? I'll give you a very close to home example. My kid's public school, right? So when I go to the school as a visitor, I need to go to the front office and I need to produce my ID, which I feed into a machine, which checks against a list. My name is John Smith. There are lots of people wanted by the law in Texas whose names happen to be John Smith. The machine always rejects me. So I have to go to the humans who are staffing the front desk and ask them if this person who in his previous job briefed the president in the Oval Office and went to White House Situation Room meetings, can I please go to story time with my daughter? And often it takes quite a conversation. I would be more than happy to sacrifice a little more privacy, provide a little more personal information to disambiguate me from the other John Smiths that the law wants. Now, as an industry, right, that my employer is part of, we are in the business of providing customized cybersecurity solutions, customized to the needs of our customers and their policies and the legal regimes that apply to them, and those would include privacy policies. So privacy is very important to our company and others like it. We emphasize it, make it a priority. But it is foolishness to think that in this modern technological society that we can have absolute security and absolute privacy. There is going to be times where trade-offs are appropriate, and it's going to be very interesting to see how our society continues to make those trade-offs. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Next question is for Ian Wallace. To what degree is the United Nations useful in preventing cyber terrorism, and can we rely on the UN to support U.S. security efforts? Also, what are the risks of us acting unilaterally?
So I would share the view that you heard from Scott, which cyber terrorism isn't a particularly useful term. To the best of my knowledge, at least, no one has actually died as the result of a cyber attack. And if you think of what a terrorist is trying to achieve, which is often a degree of spectacular shock, something that is has limited likelihood of actually causing any physical harm isn't necessarily what they're trying to achieve. If you're a terrorist, there are better ways of achieving that goal than getting on your computer. That said, there are definitely ways in which terrorists use the internet. Most obvious to our recruitment and jihadist websites have long been seen as a way of recruiting, radicalizing, particularly young men, encouraging them to go off, fight, say, in Iraq or Afghanistan. And the way that the internet has been used to support terrorism is through terrorist finance, and countries like the United States, through the Treasury Department, put a lot of work into trying to use their capabilities to deal with that and prevent money going to fund either terrorist attacks or jihadists operating in places where they're fighting against Americans and others. There is clearly a possibility of terrorists using cyber capabilities in support of attack, at least in theory. So you could imagine if, take 9/11 example, if Al-Qaeda had the capabilities and decided to use them to interfere with the emergency response networks at a time of an attack like that, you could multiply the effect of an attack quite significantly, and that is a cause of concern, and that's one of the resilience issues that DHS are particularly focused on, not least because it's one that is not necessarily federal government, but at least local governments. It's not one that the private sector has responsibility for.
Yeah.
And the United Nations undoubtedly has a role in setting a tone for managing terrorism, and they have watch lists for terrorists, and they also play a role in terrorist finance and what have you. I think what the question is probably driving at least the way I will answer it, is does the United States have an interest in working with other countries in order to managing terrorism and indeed cybersecurity more generally? And the answer is undoubtedly yes. And the State Department is doing a pretty good job now of getting out, engaging bilaterally with certain countries, and working in both conventional multilateral organizations and also beginning to establish coalitions of countries that haven't previously existed. So a good example, not a terrorist example, but it relates, is the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, which is Council of Europe originally created document which basically sets standards for countries to establish their legal system in order to prosecute cybercrime. And there is resistance in some countries to sign up to that, but even those that are resisting it, like Pakistan, are beginning to take that model and introducing it in their country. So I think multilateralism in various different forms is going to be an important part of tackling both terrorism and cybersecurity.
Comment?
So I agree with most of what you said. And there certainly has not been any cyber terrorism yet, but I know how to kill all kinds of people with cyber attacks and spread terror, and some bad guy's going to learn that at some point. So we will see it. We just haven't yet.
Next question's for Scott Borg. Can you tell us a little bit more about the Edward Snowden case, a little more than maybe is obvious from the public media?
Where to start? There's been a lot of misunderstandings about this. One of the biggest misunderstandings is people think that the NSA is reading their email. The NSA has nothing legally or administratively in place to prevent that, but in fact, that's not what they're doing. What's happening is the NSA's computers are reading a lot of people's email. Also, if you're online and you're using Gmail, Google's computers are reading your email, and Yahoo's computers are reading your email. And if you're beneficiary of some kind of security scanning that's not just in your machine, but in your organization, those computers are reading your email. And mostly we don't mind this. If I'm investigating, if I'm looking up something about a medical condition on Google, I get information and ads that are related to that medical condition. And it doesn't bother me because I know no humans are reading my email. No humans know what I'm searching for. And I don't think most people are bothered by this. It's the same way you'll sing when driving your car, and you don't worry that your car can hear you sing. It's just a machine. So really what we need to do is start making a distinction between machines reading things and machines accessing things and humans. We should have extremely strict rules about whether a human being can get access to what their computers are scanning. We should have strict rules about whether a Google employee can start looking at what you're doing online. If we make a distinction between those things, if we have a very clear distinction and we make rules about that, we can allow the machines to scan more things in more depth, and by doing so, restrict far more narrowly what humans are allowed to access. Did I say that clearly enough so that you can understand what I mean? We require very exacting criteria from the mechanically collected data, evidence, before we allow humans access. And by doing that, we can restrict what humans have access to, and we can make it sure that they only get access to a very limited number of documents that the machine has a high probability to think are worth looking at. So we need to start rethinking search warrants and rethinking access. The idea that let a machine have access and then humans have access and everybody has access is just crazy. I'm not too disturbed with what's been revealed about what the NSA is doing, because I know they have a limited number of humans to scan all of global communications, and mostly those humans are people who went to liberal arts colleges and got degrees in French and other, Japanese and other languages, and they needed a job, and the NSA hires you if you have language skills. So we've got relatively, just not sinister, spies. We've got language graduates, and all they're looking for is signs of terrorism. They could care less about anything else. So I'm not too worried about what Snowden's revealing about what the NSA is doing, but I'm really worried about the lack of good rules for how the NSA is doing this, because it seems to me it's just wide open for abuse. And I'm even more worried about the complete lack of understanding of what's going on here on the part of the public and the journalists. There's lots more you could say about this, but that's my main little sermon on that one. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott. Next question is for John Smith. You already spoke to this a little bit, but considering the state of cybersecurity law and that most of the laws were in the United States and elsewhere written before computers played such a significant role, what kind of specific legislation could you imagine that would address cybersecurity?
Yes. So there have been a couple of cybersecurity bills in Congress recently, and Raytheon's not taken a formal position on publicly on any of those bills, so I'm not going to do that either. But I'll outline what the different approaches are. One of the leading bills takes a mandatory regulatory approach, right? The idea that companies and other organizations will be required to do a certain checklist of things to make their networks more secure. So that's one approach. Another approach is, in a competing bill, is to provide more liability protection to companies and other organizations, such that if they engage in these information sharing networks, for example, or collective defensive groups, that their liability will be limited if they share something that makes someone upset, but share it with the purpose of enhancing the cybersecurity of everyone in that collective. So those are the two approaches of the two bills, the two leading bills in Congress. Neither of them have have passed both houses. So we'll see what happens. And Ian already referenced the fact that the Obama administration therefore came out on February the 12th with the first formal executive order exclusively about cybersecurity, another sign of the times, which is attempting to put together voluntary standards, so-called voluntary standards in a cyber framework that, as Ian mentioned, is being drafted now with industry input. And that executive order also launched, endorsed a program that the Department of Homeland Security had already begun called ECS, Enhanced Cybersecurity Services, which is going to be, I think, a new model, at least in terms of scale, how the government, the knowledge that the government has about cyber threats can be shared much more broadly than it has previously throughout the private sector. 85% of the critical infrastructure in this country is in private hands. So the government, which the government depends on, right, for its own communications, et cetera. So there has to be public-private cooperation. And through this ECS program, companies, and Raytheon has publicly joined this, companies will be able to receive threat data, sometimes very sensitive threat data for the government, but then turn that around to a variety of paying customers. Companies typically, perhaps, who are not as large as Raytheon don't have the cybersecurity resources that a Raytheon does, but medium and small businesses and smaller institutions, maybe this one, right, that can't afford a massive self-standing defense, but would very much benefit from having cybersecurity as a service, so to speak, informed and enriched by this government cyber threat data. So we'll see how that model works.
I don't think they're paying customers. I don't think they'd have to pay for this.
That's what's groundbreaking
Is that part
about
of
this. Not the bill, the ECS program that DHS has, right? Because you're right, a lot of collaborative activity has been among competimates, as we say, in the defense industry or in other sectors. But this is a model where these intermediaries like Raytheon and others who sign up to be trusted partners of DHS will be allowed to charge their customers.
Oh, charge their customers.
Charge their own customers, right.
Okay, we're approaching 2 hours in here now, and I'd love to do this all night, but we need to get the students back so they can do their homework. I'd like to end on a technical kind of question, since I'm a techie, and this is for Ian Wallace. Could you give us a hint, look into the future? You're an expert on military and policy for cybersecurity. Maybe speak to electromagnetic pulse technology or HARP-type systems, phase-shifted arrays, where we can potentially move the ionosphere and therefore the troposphere. Can we use these things for strategic offense, and should we be concerned about defense against these type of technologies?
I was hoping we would avoid this question. I am not a technical expert. I have I sat through several meetings on electromagnetic pulse and often wondered if I'd have to talk about it in public, and hope that I never would. I think the truth of it is it's a high impact, low probability threat, which sensible militaries around the world are addressing in a limited way by hardening their capabilities against sort of low-level instances of it. It is, I think, probably something that, as a strategic capability, countries like the US would probably want to avoid, because we would want to deter other countries from developing such capabilities to use against the United States or her allies. Not the least reason for that being that as a more technologically developed country, the US has more to lose from losing its ability to use electricity and those to use the infrastructure that depends on it. There are differences of view within the US government, I know, and certainly other governments about how much concern should be addressed to it. But I think the honest answer is most people conclude that the cost of completely mitigating the risk outweigh the benefits.
Thank you. Okay, we need to wrap up here now. Thank the distinguished speakers, thank the provost and David Kenley for inviting me to be moderator here, the president and trustees and everybody here in this campus. I've been here 15 years and I love it here, and I've had a lot of freedom to do a lot of things, and this is just one new cool thing to do. A special thanks also to Ambassador Craig, who's attending to some important business in the Middle East right now. And just a couple things about him I'd like to, and everybody here knows him, and I think had a lot to do with being here, was Ambassador Craig. He not only has a bachelor's and master's degree in international service and international relations, also an honorary doctorate from Elizabethtown College. He's also presently the chairman of the board of a large venture capital company, an international venture capital company. He is the ambassador and scholar in residence at E-Town since 2002. Previously, he was in the Clinton White House, appointed by Bill Clinton as ambassador to Oman, also in the George Bush White House, and immediately after 9/11 was appointed as special assistant to President Bush, and mentioned to students in one of my lecture classes that he would brief President Bush every Monday morning, starting right after September 11th. So you can imagine that position. He was senior director for combating terrorism in that position. He's also been a regional vice president of Boeing Aircraft, director of Arabian Peninsula Affairs in the Department of State, and deputy chief of mission in Damascus, Syria, and Bogota, Colombia, and speaks French, Arabic, and Spanish. So thank you again, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.